Let me welcome you first. I would like to acknowledge that today I am joining you from the unceded lands of the Gadigal Wangal people. For our international guests, this is otherwise known Sydney, otherwise known Australia. I'd like to acknowledge that sovereignty here was never ceded, that the resistance against ongoing colonisation continues, and that there's a marked resistance, part of which we're going to be talking about today, between the Palestinian people and the Gadigal Wangal people, and indeed all Indigenous peoples across so-called Australia. My name is Alana Lentin, and I am the chair of today's session. Before our panelists today, let me say a little bit about the network that's inviting you to this event today. So this event, the International Contours of Zionist Repression, is being organized as part of the International Coalition to End Zionist Repression. So if you don't know anything about it, the coalition, which was set up in the last few months, aims to combat attacks on people speaking out and organizing for Palestinian rights and against Zionism. The coalition consists of a wide range of organizations. Most of the organizations in the coalition are based at the moment in North America. So this event is one of the first to try to internationalize our discussions about Zionist repression as a global phenomenon, and to show how the fight against Zionism is inextricable from the fight against racism and fascism, racial capitalism and coloniality in their myriad manifestations across locations, and of course for Indigenous sovereignty, anti-colonialism, and radical anti-racist action. So I'd like you to invite, for further information, to check out the website righttorejectzionism.com. I also want to say a little bit about my role here. So my role in this instance is as one of the founding collective members of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. I'm wearing our t-shirt. I don't know if anybody can see. Yes, this is our t-shirt, just a little bit of advertising for our merch. So the ICSZ supports the delinking of the study of Zionism from Jewish studies, and to reclaim academia and public discourse for the study of Zionism as a political, ideological, and racial and gendered knowledge project that intersects with Palestine and decolonial studies, critical terrorism studies, settler colonial studies, studies of land and climate, disability, performance, and many other related areas of scholarship and activism. Two of our panelists, Younes and Antony Lerman, are also members of the advisory board, and I'd like to invite you to check out icsz.org for more information. So before introducing the speakers, a few words on the aim of the event. France, the UK, Germany, and Aotearoa are the main foci of the speakers' interventions based on their knowledge and expertise, but we also wanted to note the transnational linkages between these various sites. The discussion of Zionist repression necessarily focuses on the tactics and strategies such as propaganda, lawfare, counterinsurgency, and what Younes calls the war on anti-Semitism, counterterrorism, and carcerality, as well as the use of the rhetorical tools of ostensible anti-racism and progressivism more broadly to cement a Zionist consensus and repress and criminalize Palestinian resistance and solidarity. But in looking at these issues, we should press, I think, on Zionism as a global project of white supremacist fascism, settler colonialism, which of course its antennas reach far beyond the borders of the colonized space of Palestine itself, and racial capitalism that's going far beyond the boundaries of a Zionist lobby as an entity that can be separated out from the interests of racial states and global capital. So let me now be quiet because I've spoken more than enough. I just want to introduce the speakers. We didn't actually decide the order of speaking. This again would have been done if my Zoom link had been working. But I think we can take them in the order of the bios that I'll briefly introduce. So our first speaker is Younes, if you're happy with that, Anna. Anna is a German Palestinian scholar. Her focus rests on what she has coined the war on anti-Semitism, as I mentioned, and her work zooms in on settler colonial theories, psychoanalysis, and race-critical theories. Her most recent publication, or at least the one I could find, she's so prolific that there might be another one since then, is titled Erasing Palestine in Germany's Educational System, The Racial Frontiers of Liberal Freedom. If it's all right, I'll introduce all of the speakers and then I won't have to speak anymore. It'd be much more interesting to speak to them. Tina Ngata is a Ngati Porou mother of two from the east coast of Te Ika at Maui. Her work involves advocacy for environmental, indigenous, and human rights. And she wrote the article, Make No Mistake, There is No Indigenous Support for Israel, a very important critique of the role of Christian Zionism in manufacturing the impression of indigenous alignment with Zionism, which was the main reason why I invited you to speak today, but of course, on top of all of your other very important work. Antony Lerman is based in London. Antony is a writer focusing mostly on anti-Semitism, racism, Israel-Palestine, and senses of belonging in Europe. And he is the author, of course, of Whatever Happened to Anti-Semitism, Redefinition and the Myth of the Collective Jew, which came out with Pluto in 2022. And last but not least is Selim Nadi, who is a member of the editorial board of QG Décolonial, and he writes in French, German, and English on the European and American workers' movement and the issue of racism and colonialism, among many other things. Their more extensive bios, of course, were shared with you in the invitation to the event. So without further ado, if everybody's happy to stay on the meeting for about 10 minutes longer than, well, in the next, we projected to start at whatever time it is, wherever you are, for an hour and a half. If everybody's happy to stay on for 10 minutes longer, that'll make up for the lost time. So yes, I've invited everybody to speak about their own location for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for conversation between us. And then, of course, questions from all of you, which you can take either by raising your hand and I'll invite you to speak, or of course, you can write it in the chat if you're more comfortable with that, and I will read your question out to the panelists. Thank you. So over to Anna.
Yeah. Hi, good evening or good morning to all of you. Thank you, Alana, for this wonderful introduction to all of us and for inviting and making it possible to have this conversation. So since we were asked to give a short 10-minute introductions about our specific location. In this case, for me, this would be speaking about Germany. But also keeping in mind the topic that we're talking about today, I was thinking a little bit about maybe briefly giving the contours of what I understand Zionism to be and repression of anti-Zionist knowledge production or activism or both. So for me, Zionism essentially is working within a dialectic between internal nation-state racism and external settler colonialism. In other words, we have racism abroad, at home, so we basically export our internal racial problem to the outside, right? So in the past, that is, I think, for many people probably known as an anti-Semitism, eventually developed into a form of, exporting that population to the outside of Europe. And today, I think the major link between race, or I would say maybe it's not even anti-Semitism per se anymore, but it is racism and colonialism today, upon which the dialectic of Zionism functions. And through that, I've also analyzed my work in Germany predominantly. The repression, obviously, that unfolds targets predominantly dissent and public knowledge production and activism against this kind of mode of production that consolidates the nation state racially to the inside while profiting from its imperial outcomes. So in Germany, in my work in particular, what I found was from the 2000s onwards, in fact, that this discourse around a new anti-Semitism became an institutionalized discourse within the European framing, where Europe was busy trying to find its new post-Cold War identity, post-Cold War and Second World War identity. However, instead of essentially talking about a 500-year-old history that people could have drawn from in terms of common European history, what became one of the main pillars of common identification amongst European nation states was the Second World War, and in particular, the Holocaust. So from 2000 onwards, what we do see is international European symposiums. We do see at the same time the Second Intifada breaking out. We're seeing the war on terror starting. We're seeing the Anti-Racism Conference in Durban in 2001. And within that time in 2000 as well, we see a new citizenship law in Germany that has essentially moved from an understanding of citizenship from blood relationship, meaning you had to have a German mother or father in order to get German citizenship, to a jus soli, where you basically can get citizenship based on the right of having been born there. Since 2008, we have seen Merkel's visit to Israel and the Knesset speech, where she has said that the fight against anti-Semitism, as it is called since the year 2000, in fact, or the year 2002-1, is a national raison d'etat, essentially. So everybody has to go along, and this is what German identity and citizenship is based upon. And from there on, we see laws as well as government resolutions, as well as resolutions coming out from the parliament, just skyrocketing, in fact, and one almost trying to outdo the other. And that goes across party lines and essentially is being intensified from 2008-9 onwards. Then 2015 is the next moment in time where we have an influx of refugees, predominantly from Syria, but also Afghanistan and other countries, where this discourse, which until then I would say had been more a policy discourse and a discourse around education that usually centered prevention, the prevention of more anti-Semitism to come, on this figure of the anti-Semitic Jew, anti-Semitic Palestinian that is then attacking the Jew, and so on and so forth. So we see this kind of exploding in 2015 again and becoming a public conversation where everybody chimes in. From 2018 and 19 onwards, we do see resolutions against BDS that also coincided, ironically enough, with actual anti-Semitic attacks against a synagogue in Halle. So instead of actually talking about right-wing fascism in Germany, the immediate reaction was to declare BDS and several other organizations within Germany that would do pro-Palestinian or anti-Muslim racism activism as a dangerous liability to German democracy and security. And then from 2022, 23, and then 24 onwards, we've seen more and more repression, also public and legal, from the social code to criminal code, to immigration law, to university and school policies, as well as legal, let's say, handouts as they were given out by the police to schools, that basically tackled any kind of public conversation, even the showing of a keffiyeh or a protest sticker that would say, let's say, queers for Free Palestine. All of that would be labeled anti-Semitic and could become potentially, and actually now is, liable in front of the law. The last immigration and citizenship law changes that we had was from June or July, if I'm not mistaken, definitely June or July. So now it's essentially also required for people who come to Germany to seek citizenship to give a loyalty oath, which has been first introduced, I think, in 2013, if I'm not mistaken, which is also the first time that people have tried to, in the federal state of Hessen, to bring a statement into your citizenship application where you would need to endorse the right of Israel to exist, for instance. That was taken out in 2014 again. But now this is essentially law since for 3 months by now. And people have to not only pledge a loyalty oath to this German ethics, as they would call it, and morality and and responsibility towards the past. But what I found incredibly troubling as well is that a mere lip service would not do. So if people, or if the state, if the security services, if the school, wherever you are, in fact, and they name these institutions as well, would find out or give reason that your loyalty oath has just been a lip service, it can be revoked. And the time span of revocation is 10 years, essentially. So even if you get German citizenship today, and then you, for instance, like the Jewish Voice for Peace, which they actually state, for instance, liking someone online with a like or sharing something, that can be used against you to have your citizenship revoked again. And to prove and to show that your loyalty oath was not of internal conviction. And there's this particular sentence, in fact, that says that it has to be an internal conviction of yours and cannot just be a lip service. And then recently we had a new resolution coming out on the 5th, I think, which again is a public celebration that consolidates this national cohesion. Everybody gets really wound up about it and very angry about it. And I understand it's a very horrible document when you read it, in fact, but most of the things that have been mentioned here, which is entitled Never Again is Now, Saving Jewish Life in Germany, Securing It and Empowering It, which again has also been signed and supported by every fraction and every party in the parliament, reads like essentially like a very pro-Zionist document that has to now become a social code, apparently. What I found very interesting is that the word that is used the most in it, in fact, is Israel. There's very little about anti-Semitism, in fact. But they do speak about Israel-related and left-wing anti-imperialist anti-Semitism, obviously about Muslim and Islamist and anti-Semitism, very little about right-wing extremist racism or anti-Semitism, although this is, numerically speaking, the population that commits most of these crimes. I think there's a lot to talk about. This resolution, Never Again is Now, has just recently passed, and people find it incredibly problematic, and it indeed is. However, what I would like to say, and I'm not going through it in detail now, is that from what I've told you right now, most of these things have already been codified into law anyways. So this is more like a public performance to the outside, and more kind of like a public muscle flexing amongst and vis-a-vis parties amongst each other. Where, for instance, the AfD, the right-wing party of Germany that is also in the parliament, is now publicly sarcastically commenting that even the left-wing and the center-left or the centrist parties are now adopting AfD strategies, which is kind of ironic because it wasn't the AfD that actually brought in the first of these policy incitements, let's say, but in fact it was the center and the left that did. So actually they're not quite correct, but from the outside it seems as though there is the right that is co-opting this discourse, when in fact it was quite the opposite. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. I don't know if I made it within the time span of 10 minutes.
You definitely did. I'm just wondering, because of the particularity of each context, whether anybody has any questions that are particularly to Anna about the German context and this new resolution, before we move on and have the next speaker. I mean, it was very clear that's not the point, but it's such a, I think it's an example of something that everybody's talking about at the moment. So I was just wondering if anybody has anything at all that they'd like to ask. If not, then that's fine. We'll move on to Tina, and then we'll have a discussion at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Alana. Tēnā koutou, very nice to finally be able to be here with everybody discussing these really important issues. Thank you, Alana, for convening the panel as well. My name's Tina Ngata, and I am a Ngāti Porou wahine from Te Tairawhiti on the East Cape of Te Ika Maui. And I'm an Indigenous rights advocate And of course, we here in Aotearoa are currently undergoing probably the most far-right government we've had for a long time, and are really moving back to a number of our resistance roots. We've maintained resistance to colonialism, obviously, for many generations, but we are, like many places in the world, in response to the global rise of the far right, experiencing far right governance here in Aotearoa as well. So just sending my acknowledgements out to our Indigenous brothers and sisters who are connected by colonial oppression around the world. And it would be remiss of me this morning not to acknowledge that this week marks the 1 year mark of the passing of an incredible Mexica leader and Indigenous rights freedom fighter, Tupac Acosta, who supported and mentored numerous generations of Indigenous rights advocates around the world and supported many of us to bring our issues to, transnational forums like the United Nations and other gatherings. And one of the things that Tupac said to me and to a number of us over the years is that, the colonial machine has stepped into this kind of new phase. It's become very finessed in its application. And we also have to step up our game to match that finesse, to match that sophistication, not in terms of resource, but in terms of a more sophisticated critique and strategy of, against coloniality. And so what I've recently argued is that, Indigenous critical analysis needs to be honed and exercised in order to be able to identify and dismantle the structure of colonial violence that enables Western colonial projects, which is exactly what Israel as a member state is. And so my area of focus for many years now has been the doctrine of discovery. Indigenous peoples, just want to acknowledge Indigenous peoples and our rights struggles are not a monolith, but there are shared political positions that we have co-crafted, and that's been built also out of a shared experience of colonial oppression that stems from the application of the doctrine of discovery, which is why, these doctrines are mentioned within the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a part of the context that frames our dispossession worldwide. And that's something that is a commonality across all Indigenous peoples. And we know, preambles, that's what preambles do. They provide that important context. But what we also know is that, the story of the doctrine of discovery, which is that this in the earliest stages of that, where we see the codification of militarized European entitlement to non-European lands, where we see that happening through the doctrine of discovery story, is first and foremost the Crusades and the Holy Lands. And in fact, many white supremacists still today, including the Christchurch terrorist who carried out the 2019 mosque attacks, cite Pope Urban, who called for the Crusades in the first place, and they often cite, crusade nostalgia in their manifestos as they're about to carry out white supremacist violence against synagogues and against mosques and against, whole communities as well. And so that kind of crusade nostalgia is quite common across white identity extremists around the world. And these papal bulls, which contextualize those crusades and the Holy Lands, were eventually extended out to West Africa to incept the West African slave trade, and then extended across the New World to incept the so-called Age of Discovery and herald an era of European imperial expansionism and extraction around the world. And that's the formation of what we today sometimes call the global North and global South regions, which I think are a very clumsy way to describe, the colonizing and those who have been and are still experiencing in different ways colonization that has originated and been incepted through European imperial expansionism. So over successive centuries, this situation grew into a global political economy that was crafted based upon the privilege of these systems. And these aspects were institutionalized within the Bretton Woods financial system and the United Nations systems, which maintains this legacy of imperial privilege for superpowers, both through, for instance, the voting power allocation model of the Bretton Woods system, and the veto system of the Security Council. So these aspects of the colonial landscape have uniformly oppressed Indigenous rights around the world, and they've maintained colonial power. And this is what has brought Indigenous nations together around the world repeatedly over years. And not just in the UN, but through our own personal solidarity movements as well between our Indigenous nations. And that forms the basis of a common Indigenous politic. And that's obvious, as I said, not to say that we are in any way a monolith or that our, colonial experience is homogenous, but that there are commonalities that stem from the global nature of the colonial and European imperial project, and that's formed a global political economy designed by European colonialism and a market of corporate empires that are also rooted in the same colonial history. And so every year, we hear at the United Nations Expert Mechanism for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Permanent Forum for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues, we hear these resistance stories as well as the oppression stories of our Indigenous nations around the world. And we know who each other are because we have been showing up for each other for many generations now. And we know that there are consistencies in that space. For instance, every year China shows up to the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues just to declare that there are no Indigenous people in China. Russia has similarly done the same thing as member states. And colonial member states, another pattern is that colonial member states such as so-called United States, so-called Canada, New Zealand, Australia, they consistently rally together, and they always also offer the same glowing reports of how well they treat their Indigenous peoples, right before we hear report after report from Indigenous organizations around the oppression of those member states. So we know who the oppressors are, we know their patterns, we know their rhetorical tools because we've been working in that space, and we have seen and heard our Palestinian brothers and sisters give testimonies about Israeli state dispossession and forced displacement of Palestinian and Bedouin communities at the United Nations and in these global forums for many years. And we have consistently stood in solidarity with them. And this year we have again, through the Global Indigenous Peoples Caucus at the United Nations, we made a very clear statement that we collectively stand in solidarity with our Palestinian brothers and sisters. And who hasn't shown up at any of those gatherings as Indigenous peoples? Israeli organizations. There are no Israeli Indigenous organizations that have shown up at the United Nations or, to my knowledge, any other global Indigenous rights forum in this way. And in fact, up until relatively recently, Israel have openly celebrated their status as colonizers, and in some spaces we see evidence of them still, celebrating their status as colonizers. Of course, Ben Gurion proudly and openly referred to the Israeli state project as a colonial exercise. But now we see that Indigenous rights has this kind of social currency, and colonialism is being roundly condemned by the Indigenous community, that the rhetoric is slightly shifting, and you have Indigenous rights being claimed by the Israeli member state. Well, Indigenous rights have never been the purvey of member states as well. And so we know through our experience and our time in the space as an Indigenous community that they're not actually in the space of Indigenous rights, that they're very squarely in the space and have been testified by Bedouin and Palestinian brothers and sisters to be oppressors in that space. So the global condemnation of colonialism is a product of the global Indigenous community who has stood in resistance to colonialism since its rise through the doctrine of discovery. And Indigenous rights only really has the social currency it has today because of this consistent intergenerational Indigenous struggle. We know who each other are, we're familiar with each other's struggles, but of course, none of this matters to Israel because they're very audacious in their attempts to try and claim indigeneity, to try and claim some kind of social currency and legitimacy through abusing what I would consider to be a sacred taonga, a sacred aspect that we have fought long and hard to grow, which is the current social currency around Indigenous rights and the condemnation of coloniality. But we're familiar also with the rhetorical tools that Israel as a member state utilizes. So when Israel denies genocide is taking place in Palestine, of course we're familiar with that, because in all colonial contexts around the world, genocide has been denied by the perpetrator. It is denied by the Indonesian government in spite of evidence brought forward of brutal genocidal actions in West Papua, and we stand by them. We stand by our Uyghur brothers and sisters. We stand by our people in Taiwan, our brothers and sisters in Taiwan, in Hawaii, across so-called Canada and United States, all Indigenous peoples experiencing the broad brutality of colonial oppression have our solidarity, and that's how that movement has grown over time. Genocidal actions by the French government in Kanaki have recently been reported by Kanak feminist leaders, and of course France denies that too. So the doctrine of discovery is literally the story through which the West took the impermissible and made it permissible for certain groups, took the immoral and made it moral so long as it was in the first instance played out by European nations, but eventually so long as it was permissible, so long as it was played out on the European designed game board, the political economy designed by Europe that came to surround the world. And so long as it sits within the rules of that political economy designed by Europe, again, it becomes permissible. So Indigenous peoples, with the experts on colonial oppression, including the multiple forms of genocide by colonial states, including cultural genocide as well, by virtue of the fact that we have been its primary targets and we have led the resistance to colonial oppression throughout history, including calling out genocide, maintaining condemnation of European imperialism, even in contemporary systems and settings and in spaces where people are still learning to identify it. We have maintained condemnation for, like I said, instances of cultural genocide, even as colonial member states have consistently negated it. And so now this world is having this wonderful anti-colonial moment off the back of the genocide taking place in Gaza, and also off the back of the long-standing global Indigenous struggle and the solidarity movements in that space. But in order for this to truly end, we need to see colonialism as it's playing out everywhere. So yes, the West designed the global playbook and the rules for everything to play out in the way that it is, but it's very simplistic to say that it's only Western European member states that are responsible for colonial harm. Many member states and superpowers, including BRICS nations, also carry out this neo-imperial harm using that same playbook and on the same game board designed through the doctrine of discovery. And this is, of course, in addition to many so-called allies in Western nations who say that they stand in solidarity with Palestinians, but they cannot and do not identify and stand out against colonialism being carried out against Indigenous peoples on the lands upon which they are standing. And as they declare their anti-colonialism for Palestine, they have to also acknowledge that they're standing on colonized lands. Otherwise, they're not really anti-colonial, they're anti-Israel. Of course, we're all anti-Israel, but not everybody who's anti-Israel is anti-colonial. So this is why I argue that an Indigenous critical analysis, which necessarily includes knowledge of Indigenous rights and movements and their histories and solidarities and relationships around the world, Indigenous mandates that move beyond individual identities and across to collective interests, knowledge of colonial rhetoric and the narrative tools that are used and the other indicators of coloniality, and understanding of Indigenous and colonial political landscapes at the local, national, and global level. And we need all of those things in order to bring about the very overdue reckoning of the global superstructures that maintain this colonial privilege and that are enabling and protecting Israel to carry its genocide out today. And of course, that enable further colonial fires to be set off around the world. When we apply a model of honed, finessed Indigenous critical analysis, for instance, to the case of the so-called Indigenous Coalition for Israel, which has minimal people that are Indigenous to the nation upon which it's based, which is here in Aotearoa, minimal people, minimal Maori. Within this so-called Indigenous coalition, it's largely made up of people who are closely associated to the conservative, far-right Christian and Zionist spaces, who have supported far-right Western state political positions across time, and in fact have been, some of which have been politicians for far-right parties. We see that, you know, that organization is absent from Indigenous rights forums, and so even though they espouse their views, those views align with Western nationalism, cannot be identified as an Indigenous political view. And similarly, fundamental Christian conservatism with Indigenous faces in front of it, you know, is exampled by this, you know, for instance, Destiny Church here in Aotearoa, who may have Indigenous members, which they love to push to the front for these optics, but that does not make their position one that can be described as an Indigenous political position. And so it's through this lens of Indigenous critical analysis that we can confidently say that there's no Indigenous support for Israel. I'm going to leave it there. I'm not sure if I too have gone over time, Alana, but that's my contribution, and I look forward to the discussion.
No, thank you. That was marvelous. And I think in the discussion, I don't want to stop here because obviously there are also kind of regional interests, but there are lots of similarities with so-called Australia. And I'd love to talk a little bit later on about how the argument of Jewish indigeneity to Palestine and the link up with certain figures in the far right, kind of indigenous spaces within far right Christian Zionist spaces, how these figures are being used to launder collusion of these other settler colonial states with the genocide in Palestine. But yeah, let's move on to Antony, and hopefully we'll be able to come back to these discussions all together when we're thinking about these transnational connections in our panel discussion at the end. So over to you, Antony. You're on mute. Let me unmute you.
Don't know how that happened. Yeah, so thanks for inviting me, and it's already been fascinating listening to Anna and to Tina, and I've already learned a great deal. I have to say, though, from the outset, I'm going to disappoint slightly because in preparing my remarks, I rather focused on an aspect of the blurb that you gave us to sort of think about. I rather decided that I was going to focus on what I thought was the greatest challenge that might be facing us as pro-Palestinian activists and anti-racists in relation to Zionist repression. So I'm not going to say a great deal about the UK. And clearly, if anybody wants to know more about specific developments in the UK, I'm happy to say something, you know, in answer to questions. But of course, there's a sense in which my approach to this issue is very much influenced by what has been going on in the United Kingdom, and so although, you know, I don't make a lot of specific references to the UK, you can take, in a sense, very much what I've said as reflecting not just my own views, but others who are allies in this struggle against Zionist repression. So I think the first thing that I want to say is actually rather obvious, and that is that Zionist repression is an international phenomenon. I think, Alana, you already made reference to this, but I feel it's important to acknowledge the fact, as it both points to the scale of the problem and perhaps how it can be challenged. For while there are specific ways in which it manifests itself in different parts of the globe, and therefore requires local treatment, and there's a sense in which we've already seen that in relation to the two speakers that have gone before me, the transnational character of Zionism, both as an ideology and institutionally as a field of racial governance, suggests that an international approach to challenging it could be effective. For example, in the USA and UK, where the Gaza war and genocide-related marches, demonstrations, happenings, and campus protests attracted extensive attention, some of it positive, a lot of it very negative, but it showed the degree to which it was possible to get under the skin of the authorities and the Zionist organizations and have an impact. In the view of some Palestinians, I know as a result, the Palestinian movement, I'm told, is immense today, though they concede that there is a need to be more strategic using this support. Here in the UK, on the plus side, there is evidence of significant resistance operating at various levels, amplifying the Palestinian voice and mounting legal challenges to Zionist repression applied to outspoken Palestinian and pro-Palestinian individuals. However, there is a temptation to see Zionism as an abstract force, a political ideology functioning, as it were, on autopilot, a force in the bloodstream of political life without human agency that can, by some means or other, be eliminated. And this, I contend, is a mistaken notion and not a path I think it's very useful to go down. First, Zionism, an abstract noun, is an idea, and like all ideas, it cannot be eliminated. You cannot wage a war against it. If we do not acknowledge this, we may be chasing a chimera, and as a result, in danger of downplaying or minimizing the significance of the interlocking and interdependent harms for which Zionist repression is responsible. Second, the act of fulfilling Zionist objectives, of perpetrating repressive actions, is a result of human choice, human direction. The face of Zionism we see today, the only form that currently has any agency, is expansionist, colonizing, suffused with strictly Orthodox Jewish religious messianism, allied with far-right political thinking and activism. It is a continuous project to purify the tribe. So-called alternative Zionisms, such as liberal Zionism, have no agency, merely fig leaves obscuring the reality of apartheid and in themselves contradiction in terms. If this was not clear before 7th of October, the theory and practice of genocide in Gaza as a means of fulfilling Zionist objectives is plain for all to see, and it reduces to its essence the contingent relationship between the Jewish state and the Palestinians. Not only are they dispensable and unwanted, as 100 years of ethnic cleansing, dispossession, expulsion, and the never-ending Nakba have shown, they are now subject to mass dehumanization, a demonization by way of being seen as synonymous with Hamas, that is, they're characterized all as terrorists, and as being implicated in the 7/10 so-called pogroms, and I put that in inverted commas because I think it was an appalling use of entirely wrong parallel. They are quintessential. The Palestinians are seen today as the quintessential anti-Semites. The Palestinians are Nazis in modern form. It is this treatment of the Palestinians that I regard as the greatest challenge of Zionist repression. But I don't think this dehumanization would have been possible without the softening up process in many countries brought about by the weaponization of anti-Semitism, so effectively packaged, delivered, and applied in the form of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. And I can tell you that in the United Kingdom, I would say perhaps outside of Germany and the United States, it is country in which IHRA indeed reigns supreme across many sectors of society and many organizations, local authorities and universities and so on. This, as I've often said, that's to say the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism is a racist charter targeted at the Palestinians. To be clear, to treat the narration of Palestinian experience as Zionism which is objectively about dispossession, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and the suppression of Palestinian culture and identity, as unacceptable hate speech when it isn't, an attempt to outlaw it can only ever be temporarily successful, as the history of the last 100 years has shown. It would be wrong, however, to see this as plus ça change. As the president and the co-director of Al-Shabaka, Tarek Bakoni and Yara Hawari, emphasized in a recent podcast, marking a year since the Israeli assault on Gaza began, Palestinians face unprecedented challenges, and that there is no going back to 6 October, Tarek says. The Gaza genocide is the bloodiest episode in Palestinian history, worse than the 1948 Nakba, they both argue. It has brought about global change, says Tarek, quote, showing the limitations of the post-World War II international order and the racisms and hypocrisies of so-called Western democracies. It has completely shattered the illusion that we are living in a world of multilateral governance, Tarek concludes. He also argues that, quote, we must take Zionism out of its exceptional mold. Genocidal regimes in the past have killed, murdered in ways that are brutal and horrifying. Gaza is a particularly egregious example of that because we are witnessing it live on our screens. The perpetrators and their enablers do not regard Palestinians as humans. This is what enables them to continue with the sadistic violence. But it showed that Israel is stoppable, since it could not have embarked on this genocide without US help. It is reliant on empire, as it has been since the Balfour Declaration in 1917. Zionism has always been presented by its advocates as the antithesis of barbarism, a posture that the USA and many Western states have adopted. And that barbarism is personified not just in Palestinians, but in Arabs in general. Those who could stop Israel see Israel as a banner of a civilizational, civilizational project, so they choose not to do so. In the past, the existence of Israel has been successfully protected in the Western mind by being wrapped in the garb of liberal Zionism, an imaginary world in which the notion of Zionist repression did not hold sway. While that image still prevails in some circles, particularly parts of diaspora Jewry and political groups persuaded by the contention that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, the totality of Israel's actions over the last year in Gaza, the West Bank, against dissidents in pre-67 Israel and in the wider region, nakedly justified by the spokespersons of the Judeo-fascist Zionism now prevailing, have laid bare the reality of Zionist repression and its principal victims. And this is a genie that cannot be pushed back into its box. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Antony. I think talking about how we can stop this is fundamental to our discussion. There are obviously link-ups between your remarks and also Anna's remarks with regards to kind of legislation, particularly the IHRA. I mean, I suppose I don't want to open the discussion up too much now, but it would be interesting to put this in juxtaposition with Tina's remarks of kind of setting what we see currently in Palestine in the context of the longue durée of colonial domination and genocide as a European civilizational project, to say that we need to, and I'm sure you wouldn't disagree, to trace this much further back than kind of these attempts to so-called weaponize anti-Semitism in more recent times. And, you know, I think, yeah, on the one hand, it's right not to see Zionism as some kind of amorphous, you know, kind of unstoppable force that's just out there, that we have to name it. But at the same time, we need to think in much more kind of linked up ways about what function Zionism serves within colonialism writ large, but I'm sure we all agree on that. All right, so thank you very much. Let me turn that to our last speaker, Selim Nadi. I think you need to unmute. Do I need to unmute you? I'm not sure.
All right.
Sorry.
Hello. First, I'm really sorry, but the conditions for me are not very good. I have some computer issues, so I'm on my phone, and my daughter is sleeping in the door next to me. So, well, but I'm very glad to be here to discuss this issue with you. Before I begin to really discuss the matter, I would just like to remind that France has in his prisons, so has detained a Lebanese fighter named Georges Ibrahim Abdallah since 1984. So I was born in 1989, so this man is in prison since before 5 years before I was born. And the charges are without a real basis, and he has been refused to be released, despite the fact that his release should have taken place several years ago. So I will address the French pressures on the anti-racist and anti-Zionist movement in France, but I just would like to remind, like it's the case for other countries, that France is directly involved in the imprisonment of activists fighting against Israel. And so the first thing I want to remember is that France has historically been a colonial and imperialist power, and its support for the Zionist state did not begin on October 7th. So for a long time, mainstream medias and politicians have been lamenting on the so-called importation, I quote, of the conflict into France, since for many young Arabs living in France, the Palestinian question is essential. Yet I think it's the French state itself that by supporting Israel wholeheartedly, notably through arms sales, contributes to this so-called importation. This is why the issue of state racism and France's Zionist alignment are so closely connected. So for the anti-racist movement, the critique of the French state is always linked to critique of its support of the Zionist state. So moreover, while the French state continues to denounce new anti-Semites, so understand Arab people, I would like to point out that France is also a historically anti-Semitic state. We all know, of course, the role of the French state in the oppression and murder of Jews during World War II, but we could certainly look even further back. So it seems necessary here to link the anti-Semitism and colonialism of the French state to understand its repression of anti-Zionism. So firstly, French Zionists who claim to fight against anti-Semitism start from the same premise as a significant part of European anti-Semite, real anti-Semitic people. And this premise is that Jews supposedly lack a state, and thus, according to Zionists, it needs to be created. So far from seeing Jews as stateless, we recognize, when I say we, I mean the decolonial movement. We recognize them as a full French citizen and emphasizes the importance of separating the fight against Israel from support for Israel, which is always done by the French state. Always when the French government or support of the government are speaking about anti-Semitism, it is always to speak about Israel. On the contrary, in fact, the anti-Zionist stance of the French decolonial movement is also rooted in the struggle against anti-Semitism. So we always consider French Jews as a French, German Jews as German, etc. And we do not try to link them in any way with the Israeli state. So it would be a genuine historical challenge to try to demonstrate that Polish Jews have any legitimate claim to a state in Palestine. One of the characteristics of Zionist ideology, who it shared with anti-Semitism, is precisely this attempt to homogenize Jewish population. And the novelist Hassan Kanafani wrote a study on Zionist literature, and he wrote that one of the characteristics of Zionism is that it aimed to make Jews a homogeneous people. And the Moroccan Jewish Marxist Abraham Sarfati wrote something very similar about Jewish people living in Arab countries. So he was writing about Morocco. Yet French Zionists revived the long-standing idea of the stateless, wandering Jew when they accuse anti-Zionists of denying Jews the right to a state. In fact, the struggle against Zionism is also a struggle to recognize Jewish people as French, English, Moroccan, and so on and so on. In our view, fighting anti-Semitism also means fighting for Jews to be recognized and treated as citizens in their countries, and not try to link them to Israel. So it is in part denying them the French citizenship, exactly like it's done for Arab or Black people or Roma people in France. Just it is done in another way. So moreover, the intense anti-Semitism in Europe that developed in the 19th and early 20th centuries in no ways justifies the expropriation of land and Zionist colonization in Palestine. And so the goal of those resisting anti-Semitism was not the colonization of Palestine, but the end of anti-Semitism in Europe. So it is strange that for certain scholars, politicians, journalists, etc., in France, but also in other countries, the fight against anti-Zionism has taken precedence over the fight against anti-Semitism. So for them, it is more important to fight anti-Zionism than really existing anti-Semitism, like the anti-Semitism of the French far right, who is one of the most important political party in France. So the repression of anti-Semitism in French is mainly constructed in the idea of Arab anti-Semitism that supposedly must be criminalized to protect French Jews. So every Arab is a potential suspect. I work in I teach. I'm a history and a German teacher in high school, and it's very clear. You can really see this in the school, and it's the same in the school from my daughter, where a lot of Arab people are going. So it presented its racist laws and its state racism as a safeguard for Jews against the supposed barbaric anti-Semitism of Arabs. And one of the biggest Israeli organizations, the CRIF in France, who is presenting itself as a Jewish organization, as a purely Jewish organization, is very close to the far right. Well, and the last thing I wanted to say is that I'm speaking about state racism, but very recently, state Zionism has received certain support from leftist and far left circles that are very inspired by Germany, actually, and by the so-called anti-Deutsch movement, and some even claim to be decolonial. So they are saying that the very creation of Israel is a kind of decolonization. They are speaking about the independence of Israel. So, well, I just wanted to say this because today it is very difficult when we are in like leftist or far left circles to discuss, because there are always this suspicion who was coming initially from the state, but is now also coming from people in our circles of supposedly Arabic anti-Semitism. So I don't want to, and I will finish on that. I don't want to overstate the importance of the left and far left, and its support, its certain support. It's not the whole left, of course, to Zionism. It's far from being a mass movement, but it has a very important ideological work. They are invited in very big journals to discuss and to say that, look, all leftists are not supporters of Islamo-leftism, what the French state is calling Islamo-leftism. And so, well, I could say a lot of things, but I think I will stop here. I hope you understood some of my ideas, because I'm very aware of my French accent. And so well, if you have other questions, I can answer them. But of course, what I said is not something very specific to France, and can be also be found in other countries. So, well, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Selim. And this actually opens up a topic, I think, of a very important conversation between all of us, and a way maybe to start the discussion around the kind of the transnational linkages between the various locations, but also more wide, further afield, because obviously, as everybody has emphasized, none of this is particular to the specific locations in which we find ourselves. And this links to a comment that I made in my introduction, and also in the overview that I wrote for the event, around the use of anti-racist, or more generally progressivist, or even more radical leftist and even decolonial languages, as Selim has just introduced, to I want to use the term whitewash Zionism, but I think it goes further than that. I think it's about embedding Zionism in all spaces, which is what we're actually seeing. This is not something that's being confined to the state, or only to the far right, but also to the so-called left. And I think, we see this in various guises. For example, the use of hate speech legislation, which we know has a long lineage of actually emerging from militant Zionist front groups like the Anti-Defamation League, but how that's embedded itself in the US, particularly within so-called anti-racist education, particularly at the level of what they called K-12 education, so all across the schooling years, also within universities in the US in terms of mandatory anti-Semitism training, but also I think within research paradigms in universities, what can be researched, what can't be, and the use of something that the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism recently discussed on a panel that's part of our podcast series, which is the title was "Oh, and Islamophobia." In other words, attaching other anti-racism struggles to this kind of top-down hegemonic war on anti-Semitism, as Anna would put it, as a kind of an aside and a kind of a way of pretending that this is not a kind of manufacturing consent for Zionism, but it's actually a way of really addressing other types of racism. I mean, just to take an example from the location that I find myself here in so-called Australia, which is a land, a continent which, as we know, is still colonized, which sees the highest number of in terms of the incarceration of Indigenous people. It's absolutely on endemic scale. The theft of children, Aboriginal children, from their parents is spiraling out of control. And the level of repression and socioeconomic poverty, etc., that Indigenous people is just off the charts. But we're seeing this kind of name checking of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and down the kind of chain. Oh yes, and anti-Indigenous racism, as if that's an aside in a settler colonial context. So I'm just wondering, to start us off, if anybody's interested in thinking about how transnationally we could think about how discourses of or practices of ostensible anti-racism are part of the picture of Zionist repression. So I'll just throw it out there. And in the meantime, if anybody else has any questions that they'd like to pose to the panel, please raise your hand, or you can use the little react heart-shaped button at the bottom to use the raise hand function, or obviously write your question in the chat.
Alana, I guess one of the reflections that I have upon the points that you've made there also is that, particularly under Indigenous critical analysis and this awareness of the doctrine of discovery, is that in the codification of colonialism through the doctrine of discovery happens through these early papal bulls. 1452 Dum Diversus explicitly couples the language in the papal bulls is Saracens and pagans as enemies of Christ, and the entitlements that are granted through these papal bulls, through these 15th century papal bulls, are very clear and explicit: to invade, to search out, to capture, to vanquish and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever and other enemies of Christ. And as I mentioned in my discussion, this is what drove and incepted the transatlantic slave trade. It's also what drove and incepted the European expansionism and the global colonial project. And everywhere that it went, it took this mentality and embedded it as a part of the heart of colonial nation building. And that colonial nation building, as it happened around the world, mirrors what we're seeing being done by the Israeli member state. In fact, if you have a look at what they call the Great Dying of the Americas, where, depending on the scholar that you have a look at, that you're listening to, is between 53 and 100 million indigenous lives taken after Columbus's arrival over a 100-year period. But if we're going with the figures of what we're seeing happening in Gaza and extend that out to 100 years, there's roughly commensurate in terms of the level of lives being taken, which is another reason why Indigenous peoples are so steadfastly in solidarity with Palestine, because we have seen this play out as a part of the global colonial project at the time, and that is rooted in Christian fundamentalism, which manifests obviously in this current context as Zionism. And it has carried many masks, and many of those masks have been and colonial fictions, which is the colonial fiction of benevolence, the colonial fiction of paternalism, the colonial fiction of inevitability, of necessity. All of these have been colonial rhetorical tools that we're also seeing Israel roll out in their defense of their project, of what I argue is a Western imperial project that's playing out using a Western imperial playbook that has been designed through this history as well. So there's just some of the Indigenous peoples through the colonial project have been coupled with Muslim communities across time in this space as being targets for fundamental Christianity. It's just the point I wanted to make in response to what you've said.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting how top-down ostensible anti-racist projects that are kind of spearheaded by the state and mainstream institutions do a lot of work to try to separate that relationality and to pretend that racisms exist in different silos and that they're not connected to each other in the ways that you've been describing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the Indigenous rights discourse has grown out of a space of collectivity. Indigenous liberation is always using the language of the need to reconnect, to recognize and support each other in our spaces, to believe each other when we are calling out genocide that's happening on the lands that we, and standing in solidarity with each other in that space. That has been the basis of the growth of Indigenous rights. Which has grown the social capital that it has, which, some Indigenous bad faith actors are currently trying to capitalize upon. But it's also through knowledge of that space that we're able to instantly identify them, 20 feet away and shoot them out of the sky, I guess, is one way to talk about it. But these things are done only through the understanding of these histories and the solidarity that we've exhibited towards each other over time.
Yeah, 100%, which is why I think it's really important to press maybe a bit further. Maybe others have comments on it, but the points that Selim raised, so the usage of the language of decolonization or decoloniality or anti-colonialism with regards to Zionism And the way that's being used from the left to kind of shut down anti-Zionist action is something that I wonder if anybody else wants to pick up on.
Yeah, I think I would like to chime in briefly because there's so much right now on the table already. I want to add to what you, Alana, and Tina have touched upon right now, which is the conquest of the Americas, the so-called discovery moment, supposedly, and at the same time, the war with the at that time Mamluk and Arab and Muslim empires at that time. And I think historically as well as epistemologically in academia, these racisms have been studied quite separately. There's this trend of looking at Christianity in the Americas, for instance, right? Although when you actually read the early works of what's his name? Oh no, I'm blanking on his name. Anyways, he basically said, okay, we might be talking about, can we raise those people into Christianity and therefore into humanity, right? But what we're doing on the ground is actually the entire opposite. Funnily enough, the Spanish Empire at that time produced way more knowledge about the Middle East or the so-called North African and Arab Empire at that time than they had actually a track record of what was happening in the Americas. So there's been genocide and complete erasure on one side, and then there was an actual war with the so-called Oriental, right, which actually fabricated most of the imperial mindset, funnily enough, but then it was kind of practiced on indigenous people in the Americas. And I think we need to, now 500 years later, we're coming to this reckoning in a way where these things are coming back together, right? And these isms of, whether it's Christianity or not is one of the driving forces or not. I think it very much is about what was already said by Tina, this imperial colonial mindset. And to kind of link that now to your question, Alana, about and what Selim said about decolonial so-called colonial left, anyway, the decolonial colonial left. I think when we think about colonial counterinsurgencies against, people who resisted, there's been in history many ways of how this was essentially co-opted by the state, right? So we see in the 19th century with the just recently freed Black population of England in the United States of America, that in order to get, not give full citizenship to free Black people of England and America, to essentially give them their own colony in their so-called supposed homeland then, which was a carved out space in Africa that we today know as Sierra Leone and Liberia, right? So we actually have the first settler colonial enterprise, which is imperial for this new emerging imperial power, in this case, the United States of America, and the crumbling one, which was the Brits at that time, to kind of solve their inherent contradictions by continuing the colonial and imperial mindset, by giving, and that was the language at the time, by emancipating their formerly enslaved peoples, by giving them now the part of Africa that they're still ruling, and thus also using them as, an imperial tool to continue their imperial exploitation, and having actually a bastion of or fortress, settler colonial fortress, such as, Australia or New Zealand is today, as a regional power to control the rest of, the surrounding countries and Africa in total. And then I think we see post Second World War, and at that time, actually 50 years forward, right? So we have 1840 with Liberia, for instance, and a little earlier Sierra Leone. We have these emerging debates about Zionism actually becoming a thing for, how to deal with the Jewish problem at home in Europe, and in particular, in this case, in Germany, for instance, in England. But anyway, and then post the Second World War. So, and these terminologies there were very clearly colonial, but merged with the language of emancipating, right? Emancipating Blacks, emancipating Jews. And then post Second World War, obviously, this language of colonialism didn't fly on the international stage anymore, with, more and more countries just, coming onto, UN and international global stages, essentially having a very different view and look onto what has been done for the past 500 years to them. So empire changed its language again, right? Interestingly enough, and the counterinsurgencies then were essentially done either completely secretively, right? And the first one that actually came out in full force was the war on drugs by the US, in fact, where most of the things that were done were still secret. And then we see the war on terror, where most of the already directly and implicitly practiced techniques of counterinsurgency repression. And when I talk about what I mean by that is not only to think of the United States as a bounded territory, which is not actually. It's a little bit like Israel. In fact, it keeps on expanding until today. We already had Hawaii, and we can talk about Puerto Rico or Hawaii or Haiti. Anyways, but the idea of us and them here and there is already the imperial playbook, right? So counterinsurgency methods by imperial Western states obviously always inherently assumes that the problem we have there is the problem we have here, and vice versa, right? So since the war on terror essentially began, most of these until then secretly practiced techniques of counterinsurgencies are out in the open, and they're now codified in law, whether that is in the US or in Europe. And I've just given a few examples of what's actually being codified, had been codified by now into German law, in fact, right? This idea of not just giving a lip service of your loyalty oath to the German constitution if you want to become a German citizen, but you have to prove it, that you're internally convinced of it, right? And if not, we can still take that citizenship away from you. So yeah, I think we move from this emancipation discourse, let's say in the 19th century, to like an anti-racism discourse, a brief period in the post World War II, and then post Cold War, we see the war on terror happening, and now we have this anti-racism discourse essentially happening, right? Which I call in this particular case the war on anti-Semitism, and I call it not only because of these other wars that happened after Bretton Woods was already mentioned, came into being, but also because that's literally the language in this case Germans have used. They're constantly talking about Kampf, it's a Kampf, and it's not. I don't want to bring up the most famous book that was written in German that entails this word, right? But it literally, it's constantly a fight. And when you look at it, where it is being fought, it is essentially like it incites the individual, the individual citizen just as much as the individual politician to participate in this war, essentially, because otherwise we're losing our state, our democracy, our history, everything that we fought for. It becomes this kind of very binary thinking, and that I think of when I think of Bush, for instance, when he said you're either with us or against us, right? It's this kind of language that was put into place and then codified into law, and most of these laws and techniques had already been practiced. As I said, the war on drugs, for instance, saw all of these so-called money laundering laws against money laundering, for instance, which have now been extended to terrorism support and etc. Like so much essentially that every counterinsurgency has learned from the other, except that since the war on terror, that's what I want to say, the big shift is to anti-racism, and now also obviously to decoloniality or decolonialism, whatever, and to actually being out there in public, because this is how it's sanitized, right? We always change the language, a quarter turn to the left or a quarter turn to the right, hence, and that's how we sanitize it, I think. That would be mine. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's another piece to that, which I think is how this kind of codified now or acceptable mainstreamed war on anti-Semitism is, of course, writ large across all kinds of other methods of repression, which are ongoing. But this kind of legitimizes that more generalized repression against protest, against education, and so on. So if anybody else, we have about 6-7 minutes left. So, and I'm aware that there are no questions as yet. I would like to invite others to ask a question if they'd like to, but I'd also like to see if any of the other panelists would like to respond on this point. Was there any perhaps observations that you had, Selim, because you were the one who kind of brought up this direction in response to what Tina and Anna have said?
Yeah, actually, I was thinking about because I spoke a lot about the state, the French state, and this implies a very particular position in French anti-racism, in particularly in the Black and Arab populations. It is that our fight is a political fight. It means it's not just about deconstructing ideas. I don't know how to say it otherwise, but it's about fighting against political structures. And so I was for a long time part of this political parties, Party of the Indigenous of the Republic. And even if now we do not have this kind of party anymore because of a lot of things, the way we see our fight is always linked to strategical and political issues. And I think this is an important way to think the fight against Zionist repression, because Zionist repression is in France and in other countries, I suppose, is directly linked to the repression of those movements. For example, before any Arab organizations developed in France, the organizations were organizations for Palestine. And those are the first organizations for Arab living in France. I mean, after the formal decolonization took place, were organizations for Palestine. And so from the very beginning, our fight is a fight against the state, and it does not mean anything. It's not just a magical word. The state is something very concrete, and it means sometimes having heated strategical debates. And well, I just wanted to stress this because it seems to me a very important point, because our enemies, I mean, for example, in France, the far right, the neo-fascists, and the government are very well organized, and they are very good, I mean, politically and strategically. And so I think should be one way to think the fight against Zionist repressions in our countries. But well, of course, it depends of every country. But I mean, I'm speaking from the French point of view.
I mean, I think that's very interesting when we think about it in relation to the events in Amsterdam over the last week or so, because obviously what we saw there was an anti-fascist fight back, but it was characterized as, on the contrary, as a pogrom against Jews and Israelis, with obviously the waters being muddied between these two things. At the same time, we have, the election of Donald Trump and the Democratic Party openly using the language of fascism, which they had eschewed before, to say that Donald Trump is a fascist. But of course, nobody's for Antifa, as the USians insist on calling it. And so obviously that raises the question of, well, what is fascism and what is anti-fascism? And if we link that to, carcerality and police repression and police state violence of Palestine activism, then the avenues for anti-fascist fight back are narrower and narrower. And to me, that also kind of links up with the idea that, or I suppose the issue that Antony raised in your talk, Antony, when you said it's very difficult to fight against an idea, and so we need to fight against something concrete. So I was just wondering, I know, Tina, you have your hand up, but Antony, I was just wondering if you had any comments in relation to this question of concreteness.
Yeah, I could add something here in that, because because it's quite very interesting listening to Selim and the others, because I think the whole issue of fighting back against repressive Zionism is made so much more difficult in the UK because of the sort of hegemonic position of concern about anti-Semitism, and there's such heightened panic about it, and which is not assuaged at all by anything that the Jewish organizations or the Zionist organizations do, because as I would see it, in many respects, it plays into their hands as far as what they regard as one of their main tasks these days, which is fundamentally to defend Israel. And so the narrative, for example, around the marches, although the marches made, have made an amazing impact here with, hundreds of thousands of people coming out, but they were characterized by the political classes, not just the right, but many people in the Labour Party as well, and on the soft left, as being hate marches, and so in terms of thinking of ways of sort of concretely tackling the issue of Zionist repression in a situation where it's not the openly Zionist organizations that have this kind of stranglehold. It is the Jewish organizations in general, and the anti-Semitism organizations, and some of the most recent ones that have been created are, in effect, indistinguishable from the political stance that's taken by the far right in Israel and Netanyahu's party and so on and so forth. So there's a very repressive atmosphere here. I mean, for example, there's so much attention paid to the IHRA working definition and defending it and so on. Such that there is no equivalent for Islamophobia, right? There's no definition here in the UK, no formal definite attempts have been made to introduce that in some way into society and give it some sort of status, some kind of definition, but it hasn't happened. And it's not just because it's complicated, because actually it isn't complicated. It's because there is a kind of stranglehold on what is the main issue in anti-racism today among the political classes, and that is anti-Semitism. And if you try to point to other things, anti-black racism and anti-Muslim racism, you find you very quickly running up against people saying, oh, well, you're just introducing a sort of red herring here. The main issue is anti-Semitism. Then there's this kind of exceptionalism around it, which we are all fighting, or those of us that are opposed to this all the time, and it's an uphill struggle, very much influenced, as perhaps people know, because of the Corbyn crisis. I mean, the crisis of anti-Semitism, and our dealing with these issues today is still very much coloured by that episode, which is like, in a way, the gift that keeps on giving.
Yes, indeed. I'm wary of time, and I know that Tina wanted to say something, and Selim unfortunately already had to leave us, so we did start late, but we are already going over a little time. I just wanted to use the opportunity of what you raised there to just plug another event that the coalition is organizing. In fact, myself and Barry Trachtenberg are co-chairing an event with the title Against Definitions, which is actually also the title of the last chapter of my book, my forthcoming book. Not that I'm plugging my own work, but I am plugging our event. And we'll have an opportunity, I think, to discuss whether definitions of different forms of racism as they, to be adopted by institutions is the way to go. So I'd like to give you the floor, Tina, and then I think we'll probably wrap it up. There are no questions, sadly, but I'm sure everybody has enjoyed listening to really, really important commentary from everybody here. So over to you, Tina.
Oh, thank you very much, Alana. And I just wanted to point out, I was thinking also, as Selim was talking about the fact that Nazism has also been rooted in colonialism as well. The fact that, for instance, Hitler was inspired by American colonial genocidal actions against indigenous peoples through American colonialism. He was also inspired by Britain's brutal genocidal actions both in India and South Africa in framing Nazism herself. So these things also have these roots. But the other point that I wanted to go off from what Selim was saying, which we haven't yet discussed, is that, this colonial rhetoric has come not just through member states, but also through intellectual institutions as well and academic institutions as well. And he raised the point that the far right, as did I, that the far right is very well organized, but I think we also can't overlook that far right political sentiments are able to flourish because of the underlying coloniality of even our academic institutions as well. So we see a number of academic actors not just denying the genocide in Gaza, but also denying genocide in West Papua and denying genocide as is being reported against Uyghur families, and denying genocide in Kanaki and denying genocide everywhere. That they do this also through academia. And also, so we can see that this kind of denialism and the same mentality that happens within these member states also happens within academia because of the deep coloniality within that space, and the fact that our modern intellectual systems also arises out of the same history of defending colonialism through the doctrine of discovery as well. And so there are three drivers for there's the Bible, obviously, and fundamental Christianity. There's also the global political economy, and the third driver for this colonial privilege through the doctrine are our modern intellectual systems of academia, which also need a thorough indigenous critical analysis to be able to pass some of that colonial rhetoric out. I just wanted to acknowledge that aspect as well. Thank you.
No, and you raise a very fundamental point. And one of the things I think, I don't belabor this at this stage, but I think it's also important to point out how recent moves towards, let's call it superficial decolonization within academic institutions have also been used to create this separation. So on the one hand, yes, you have academics and academic institutions participating in the denial of genocide, the denial of ongoing colonizations of Aotearoa, so-called Australia, and so on. But you also have institutions, for example, my own, talking about Indigenous self-determination in education, while at the same time repressing students who've been involved in protesting on behalf of Palestine, and being unable even to acknowledge that there's a genocide happening that's affecting many of our students, because we have a very large community of Arab students at our university. And so there's this acknowledgement of the importance of paying lip service, at least, to Indigenous education in the settler colonial context, which we can have an argument about, but I think to a certain extent serves to whitewash ongoing settler colonialism in this place, while at the same time refusing entirely to acknowledge the ongoing colonization in other spaces, and co-opting certain Indigenous academics and students into that project because of the kind of the need to change something within these colonial institutions, which we all recognize, but the kind of the payoff in doing that, to what you agree to participate in by participating in this kind of in these kinds of initiatives, which you'll also see, how long will they last? Well, because we've already seen after the so-called racial reckoning in the United States and the United Kingdom and elsewhere after the state murder of George Floyd, already the defunding of Black Studies departments and Black Studies centers and defunding of Black academics after everybody sort of said, yes, we're going to get on board with anti-racism in what's been characterized as a moment or, you know, a racial reckoning. Yes, so I feel like we could go on all day or all night in the others. You were on yesterday, and Tina and I are today. But I don't think we have time for that, because you've definitely given us a lot of your time, and I'm sure everybody who's participated has benefited a lot, as have I, from this extremely rich discussion. I have recorded the panel, so if everybody's happy with the coalition sharing that, then I think that'll be useful for everybody else who hasn't been able to attend today due to the multiple time zones involved. So it's only left to me to thank all of our panelists for your engagement today, for all of the audience for participating today. Apologies once again for the problems with the Zoom link at the beginning. And I do hope that you'll remain in contact with us as the Coalition to End Zionist Repression, and from my part, the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. So thank you all.